Okay, it is now 11:20, and so I resume the hearing. Mr. Hargreaves.
Oh, thank you, sir. I wanted to make a number of points on a number of the areas: bricks and mortar, the Neyburn site, the percentage, the reasonableness of the 30% nomadism assumption. And I also wanted to talk about nomadic, insecure people who are not being picked up. Should we, I mean, how do you want to take those, sir? One at a time?
One at a time.
Okay. On bricks and mortar, I mean, as ORS admit, this is always a difficult area for them. Bricks and mortar communities are quite hard to identify. In fact, more than half of the Gypsy population lives in housing. That doesn't mean they're all content. It's notable that in the 2014 GTAA, ORS reported a need for 10 pitches from occupants of bricks and mortar. We did a quick survey of our own, which was in 2016, which was Annex 3 to our Reg 19 submission on the numbers. And we interviewed 11 households. We had a drop-in session for bricks and mortar occupants. 11 turned up, 6 indicated they were severely overcrowded, 9 of them, doesn't mean they're entitled to, but 9 of them indicated they would move on to a site if they could. Now,
so was that 9 people or 9 households?
9 of the households, right? Yeah. ORS, I mean, tend to say, oh, we've put out kind of circulars on Facebook and things like that, which strikes one as a singularly inappropriate medium for a community with lower literacy than they are. I mean, limited literacy is endemic among travellers. I've been embarrassed at how I'd assumed quite a few of my intelligent clients were literate and subsequently found out they'd been hiding their limited or non-existent literacy. So using written means to contact people is not enough. It has to be by word of mouth, using the networks of the community. Now, I'm pretty one of the ways that I'm pretty confident there is need from housed travellers is from my own practice, where I would say, let's say 10% of my clients are moving from housing. And I could quote various examples of that. A family who bought a house with a large garden, had caravans in the back, were then enforced against, moved on to a very overcrowded private site, and I represented them in terms of a planning application. A family where the wife and the daughter were happy living in a rented accommodation, and the father could only sleep in a touring caravan at the front of the house. I'll come back to the situation. My mind is very focused at the moment on a 12-pitch site where I've got to know the families really closely. A 12-pitch application which is about to go to appeal hearing. So it's in my mind, and I've worked with these families a lot over the last couple of years. 3 of the 12 are in housing. One is a widowed lady who moves between her 2 daughters, both of whom have a number of children. So this lady and her youngest daughter are severely overcrowded where they're living, so they're relishing, if the appeal is successful, getting a pitch. There's the other woman of the 12 who's wanting to develop the pitches is a young woman who lives with her mother, and they're so overcrowded that she sleeps on the settee. The third of the house dwellers out of the 12 is a youngish couple who are buying a bungalow with a mortgage. They've got a number of children. They took it because they just couldn't get a pitch, but they're absolutely desperate to move in with the community because of racism and snide comments by neighbours. So those are kind of typical of the spectrum of people who are coming to me, have come to me asking them to apply for planning permission from bricks and mortar. So I'm deeply sceptical that there is not a hidden need from the bricks and mortar community. Do you want to comment on that, Violet?
Doing fine.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, I'd like to look at that in the context of the York Gypsy and Traveller community. There are 350 families that we work with in the York Travellers Trust. You know, the fact that there's only 61 pictures actually demonstrates that, you know, there isn't the culturally sensitive housing provision in the area. And so I think the bricks and mortar issue, you know, and this is another example for me about, you know, the council's failure to engage with us on these issues, because we could have assisted the council to make contact with the people in houses. We've got people coming into our centre all the time. You know, Michael's just described how we did a short survey ourselves and we submitted that evidence. And so it's in that context, and it's in the context of us really wanting York City Council to actually think about the development of its oldest minority community, the one that's been here for the longest and the one which in some ways is the most disadvantaged. And we'd love to see the development of different kinds of provision and really think about the development of this community. And so it's in that context of why we think that this inquiry is so important for us to actually try and make a move. And of course, what I think we find is that, you know, and I think Michael Jones made the case, it's, you know, we hear from the landlords, we don't hear from where the community is. And if that had been wanted, then we would have thought that we would have had a strong engagement from the council. You know, even with the GTAA, we would have been delighted if we were given proper notice that to actually work with the council on thinking about that. So, you know, again, I would just want to echo what Michael has said. We think the need is far greater, and that the bricks and mortar is an area that people would want to come from.
And just to say, from my point of view, the people that we work with, the 350 families, are no means representative of all the families in York that identify as Gypsies and Travellers. Sorry.
Apologies, I didn't hear that.
The 350 families we work with in York are not representative of the full number of Gypsies and Travellers that live in York. We work with people who are in need and require some support. There's quite a lot of families in housing, and even the figure is actually above 60% for housed Gypsies and Travellers nationally. And I personally believe that that number in York is much higher. Sorry, it's worth pointing out as well, the people in houses are actually more likely to travel for work than people that are on the private local authority sites, because they're more socially, economically stable. So it's likely they keep a caravan in their drive that they then use to travel with for work.
Now turning to the Neyburn site, sir. Yeah, so that's a caravan club site, which, as I understand it, was occupied during the pandemic, has regularly been occupied in the winter months by traveller families. And in fact, one of them I spoke to who was looking for help identifying a site to develop themselves in the York area, and we were unable to help them. The point, rather than that problem is dealt with through enforcement powers, what it's symptomatic of is intense shortage of accommodation and quite a lot of gypsy people getting by, just about managing by moving round, staying on friends and families' yards, moving on when it might be a problem for the planning enforcement, the housing managers, using caravan club sites, which aren't meant to be for gypsies, often during the winter, as a good place to stay, often quite expensive to stay. I had clients who were in exactly that position in part of Cambridgeshire. Now, the family, one of the three families owned a caravan club site, which they were very kept under wraps. That it was pretty obvious to anybody who understands gypsies that most of the time, if not all, that site was used as a commercial transit site by families. And actually I was involved in getting planning permission for the families on the land immediately adjoining, but they kept hidden from the planning authority, local planning authority, that their caravan club was not really that, it was a commercial transit site and a way that people survive in the light of the huge shortage of accommodation. So that's how we should read Neyburn, right? Now it may operate as a proper caravan club, a conventional caravan club site in the summer months, but it's not how it operates at other times. And it should be seen as an expression of hidden need. Yeah? Do you want to come in on that?
Just to talk about the Neyburn site, we were contacted by York City Council's Education Department, who do know that there are Gypsy and travellers on that site, because we were asked to work with the school, who were having issues with the large number of Gypsy traveller children that were attending that actually outnumbered the non-Gypsy traveller children that were attending at that time. The school's concern was, how do we keep these children in school? So we went and we liaised with the school and we liaised with the families on Neyburn. The families made it very clear that if they were allowed to stay there, Gypsy traveller families, that were the large percentage of the people on site, that if they were allowed to stay there, they would. But the simple fact was we could do nothing to keep their children in school, because the agreement with the owner of the site, whose ethnicity I will not divulge, knew that they couldn't stay there permanently, so therefore had to leave. So they were very much Gypsy traveller people, regardless of its status as a caravan club site. It's also worth noting that I spoke to, the day we went down to talk about education, I spoke to 8 of the male residents who were Gypsy men, and 8 of them expressed a desire to stay in the York area permanently.
The third thing I just wanted to talk a little bit about is, and something that just doesn't appear in any of the iterations of the GTAA, is how and it, in a way goes back to the Neyburn point, how much people who work with and know Gypsy people, there's a sort of suppressed, there's a hidden need with people just about getting by, as I say, staying on friends and relatives, staying on caravan club sites, you know, and then we've got the new factor of the Police Crime and Evidence Act, which is going to increase the penalties for unauthorised encampment. So we've got a vicious situation where we've got a chronic shortage of accommodation, and at the same time we're increasing the penalties and criminalising unauthorised encampment. In an area like York, where there is, I think it's pretty clear the area hasn't been able to keep up with the need, people are pushed out of the area. They get by surviving. And so in my submission, there needs to be a strand in the... It's difficult to quantify. I'm absolutely not disagreeing with Mr. Moore. But there needs to be a strand in the assessment which gives voice to that suppressed, hidden need, which is a great cause of pressure and stress on Gypsy people. Do you want to, you know, and there's very much, the message we've heard, in fact, from a number of people who approach. In fact, I've had a client in Lancashire who comes from York and could never find a piece of land in or near York. And I mean, Violet, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have explained that my family are York families. I'm a York person, I feel. I approached Michael with 4 or 5 pieces of land that I was looking at for the potential of building a private individual site for me, my husband and my baby, and was advised by Michael none of them were suitable. I now have a house in Selby because that was the next best option with a large piece of land attached to it. My parents the same, York family, and I was explaining this to Mr. Walters, anybody that's got any get up and go because of the stringent policy in York and the lack of land, they've got up and gone. You've got a very negative view of who Gypsy and Traveller people are. They're the lowest socio-economic class. They're on the lowest rung of the socio-economic ladder when they're identified as Gypsies and Travellers, and it's causing a real problem with cultural identity, it's causing a real problem with mental health, and it's causing a real problem with us as an organisation that's supporting those families and trying to get a good perspective of who they are. There's also lots of research out there that shows the increased mental health problems. My own father, the reason that they left the house was he tried to commit suicide. He couldn't cope. They now have a large piece of land in Selby for him and his horses. So there is research out there that shows the negative impact on housing and the desperate need there is for sites in the area. And I do feel that York has a duty to look at the private provision and what they're doing about it, because I think the report says that there is no need for private provision. In a local authority that has no private provision, that's laughable. Particularly such a wealthy city. You're excluding a huge population of Gypsies and Travellers, and you're creating a very negative impression of who Gypsies and Travellers are.
Can I just add to that? There's hardly any private provision nationally. If you track through, let's say, the caravan camps, there has been a very major shift in the proportion of provision recorded through the caravan camps, which isn't the full picture, which are on private sites. 20 years ago, it was just about 50%. It's the same number on sites. It's now 2/3. And so that's about the energy, the desire of Gypsy people to develop their own sites, the lack of other opportunities available to them, their willingness to fight through the planning system to get a secure home, to give their family a base and for the kids to have a secure base on which to go to school. York, for whatever reasons, has been unable to respond to that need. Just coming back on this issue about how general kind of insecurity is. I'll come back to my 12-pitch appeal site. I talked about 3 out of the 12 families I'm representing. Of the other 9, 3 in the 2 years I've been working with them have moved.
Mr. Hargreaves, forgive me. I think what you're doing is referring to various sort of case studies and things like that to illustrate a particular point.
Yeah.
What would be helpful to me to make sure that the point isn't lost is if you tell me the point first and then give me an illustration so I know precisely what's going on.
So the point I'm making is that, as illustrated by my appeal site, hidden, unadmitted housing pressure leading to intense demand for people to develop private sites is a major element of the Gypsy and traveller accommodation situation in this country at the moment. And the fact that it's not represented or admitted in surveys like all of the ORSs in York is one of the factors behind the continuation of the accommodation crisis among Gypsies. So in my submission, we don't have a robust needs assessment. If you compare, even in ORS's own terms, there was a need for 72 pitches in 2014. For the same number of years, that had gone down to, in 2014 for 72 pitches. In 2017, that had gone down to 50. And in 2022, that had gone down to 40. Why? Because because you're just focusing in on the same group of people and not being alive to how much accommodation stress there is. An adequate needs assessment would find a way of contacting or quantifying or putting a figure on need from bricks and mortar occupants, from homeless, getting by, under stress families. And if we did that, we'd end up with a more robust needs assessment on which the local plan could depend. Oh, sorry, I was going to also, to kind of be a monopoly. I just wanted to make a couple of points about the 30% figure. As Violet, I have no evidence to this, but Violet has quoted the idea that nomadism may actually be higher among the occupants of houses.
That what might be, sorry?
Sorry, nomadism, people who meet the 2015 definition. It is certainly my strong impression from working with clients that nomadism is higher among less secure Gypsies, people who are getting by, moving round from place to place with family, etc. ORS's studies are inappropriately over-focused on the easiest to identify established authorised sites. And those sites will possibly have lower levels of nomadism. So we must be sceptical about the 30% figure on that basis. I do take a little of what Mr. Moore is saying about the self-selected group who I represent and go to appeal. But I don't think because people may not meet the definition, that isn't the end of the story. There are many appeal situations. Well, there's two things go on. People can change their status through the life cycle. So often, if there's a single mother with kids, when the boys grow up and start traveling with uncles, the household status may change, and certainly they may themselves generate households who will meet the status qualification. Similarly, there are a number of decisions by local authorities, a number of appeal decisions which recognise that where, let's say, there's a group of households and the elderly parents do not have status, that it would be damaging and breaking up of the family to then determine the planning application on that basis. So we need provision above those who meet the definition. And I hope I've got the figures right. According to this 2022 survey, 14 of the households who were assessed met the definition, and 24 did not, according to ORS. If I've got the figures right, that means that 14 of the 38 who were interviewed met the definition, which is 37, which is actually, I just note that that's higher than the 30%. Based on York evidence, that's higher than the 30% figure. So I'm saying there are a number of factors which suggest the 30% is probably too low. And that matters for this GTAA because of the various strands, bricks and mortar, nomadic, hidden, that just don't exist, are irrelevant and don't exist, or shouldn't be included in the assessment according to ORS. We would say, no, we need to quantify those households, and if we can't, if you can't interview them, we need a possibly more robust figure on how many are likely to come within the definition. Thank you.
Okay. It's mainly some points from before the break that the team made. So the first one is the accusation levelled from Mr. Anderson that we've sprung upon him, this roadside family, and we should have told him about it before. Surely that questions the entire robustness of their research, that they weren't aware of a long-term roadside family of 4 adults in 3 caravans. I find it very worrying that we're being blamed for them not knowing when they carried out the research to identify the need for York. So that's just one comment I'd like to put out there. I'd also like to sort of talk about the waiting list. The waiting list in York is very difficult to get on. It's very difficult to understand how it works by families. And when I've spoken to a number of families as pictures have become available, they request to be put on the waiting list at that point because they don't see any point of being on a list where there's no provision ever forthcoming. So I feel that the figures are slightly skewed there. There's also the issue of the roadside family weren't allowed to be entered onto the waiting list. Because they've been evicted off a York site, they're not entitled to be on the waiting list for a York site. They're also not identified as homeless because the only way York would accept them as homeless was if they moved out of their caravans, sold them, got rid of all their animals and moved into temp accommodation. The family weren't willing to put that burden upon the City of York's purse strings as they felt they had a roof over their head and couldn't live without their animals. So there's a couple of things there that I think is a bit concerning and needs looking at. Mr. Moore also said just a moment ago that he went down to sites, no one was there, and that's why they decided to do proxy. You went down to sites to 61 pitches, no one was there. I find that strange. You said you went down to site first and then decided on proxy. I also find it strange that if they went down to site first and then decided on proxy, why does nobody know about this piece of research on sites? Okay, you did proxy interviews, But if you went down there first, somebody would be aware of this research. I find that slightly strange. And respect where it's due. The idea that you got almost 100% return rate on your interviews proves that it's better than peer research. You didn't speak to anybody whose life hangs in the balance because of this research. You spoke to people whose duty is to manage the provision. A city that's openly said, well, the workers have openly said, they don't want any more provision to manage in York. They're not open to that, they don't want that. Maybe they had a vested interest in giving you data that was slightly lower than was needed.
Okay, I suspect that on these points we are getting as far as we can. So what I'd like to do is first of all take any final points from Ms Cannon, Mr Pittam and Mr Hargreaves before then doing the same with Councillor Waters and then going to the Council. Anything from your team there, Mr Hargreaves?
Well, I think I'd just like to make the point that I've made before, and that is that we're
well, if you've made it before, I don't need to hear it again.
Well, it's important. It's important to say that there's a basic principle of social justice, that if you are talking about people, then you talk with them. And I think the real problem that we've had is that this has not happened. It's not happened with the ORS survey. And very sadly, we started off with very good relations with the planning department, but for reasons which are probably to do with their being overstretched and 3 different sets of planners that we worked with.
Apologies, Mr Pittam, if you could just bear with me a moment until that annoying background noise stops.
Oh.
Apologies.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just trying to make the point that you can't talk about a community without talking with them. And the second thing is that despite all our efforts, and we've worked with 3 sets of planners, we came to meet with the planners with a representative from the Equality and Human Rights Commission who asked that this was going to be a good way because so few organisations support travellers in the local plan process. And they were very keen that we actually move forward with this. And we had very good relationships with the Council Planning Department at that point. There have been 2 movements since then, and sadly we've got to this point, and my feeling is...
Sorry, Mr Pittam, what do you mean by 2 movements?
Well, the planners have changed 3 times during the process from 2013, right? The chief planning officer in 2013 moved on. Then when we came to 2017, it was a different team. And now for 2022, it's also a different team. And my understanding and my sense is, because I do believe that the planners have an interest in all of this, but they probably just don't have the time. And that's the real problem, because we haven't been able to engage. And this was after you, sir, asked in 2019, was it, and in 2022, that the council actually engaged with us. And if they had done, then I think we would have been in a different place than we are today. And we're really, really interested in thinking about York within the context of an anti-racist and a city of human rights, the first UK city of human rights, of thinking about the needs of this community and thinking about an alternative way of development for them.
Okay, does that conclude everything that the 3 of you wanted to say in terms of the GTAA method?
Okay, I'll quickly conclude. What you have is a needs assessment that's been quickly pushed together based on an almost exclusive focus on evidence from the managers of the traveller sites, not of the public traveller sites, and not the travellers themselves, and completely ignoring all the other sources of need among the wider traveller community, not least the number of families who've been pushed out of York because of the maybe it's the landholding system inability to be able to acquire sites and apply for planning permission. So you've had a forced migration out of York. So we say, if you had a realistic needs assessment, you are very likely to get some net immigration back into the city. The GTAA fundamentally does not fit in with the requirements of Policy A of planning policy for traveller sites. It is not robust. It does not form an adequately sound basis for the preparation of the local plan. If it's to be made more robust, I would invite you, sir, to ask the council to upgrade it by looking seriously at the bricks and mortar issue and seriously at how you play in the hidden need. And that hidden need is difficult to identify, but it's central to addressing the accommodation crisis among gypsies. And I think YTT, if it was seriously engaged, would be happy to participate in that necessary work to turn what we have in front of us into an adequate, robust accommodation assessment which can form a sound basis for the preparation of the local plan.
Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. I'm rolling back a bit to something that Mr. Moore said some time ago, and that was in relation to his surveys on private sites. In particular, one of the sites where he turned up and there were non-gypsies in residence. And he did say that councils have little control over who lives on such private sites. I don't know whether it can indicate which private site it was or not, or whether that's not appropriate. But either way, I've got quite some experience of a private site in my ward in Merton, where the council do have considerable control over who lives on that site, but choose not to enforce such control. It's a site that was granted on appeal in 2010, and it was very cleverly written by the inspector. The conditions for occupation related to one particular individual and his immediate dependents, and if the site was ever vacated, it was to be returned to its former use. The site, over a decade, has been subject to numerous violent and very disturbing incidents. The site is currently vacated and has been for quite some considerable time. It's had quite long periods of vacation, and the council choose not to enforce the planning inspector's conditions. The difficulty in establishing other private sites, or indeed expanding the local authority sites in the city, is, and it's been quite rightly referred to, opposition from residents, parish councils and other interest groups that are faced with such sites. But if the local authority cannot enforce decent behaviour on its own sites and is unwilling to enforce sensible conditions imposed by planning inspectors on private sites, what confidence can people have in the establishment of other private sites, which perhaps indicates why there is such a difficulty, sir? If you wanted the details of that inspector's decision, I can forward it to you. It's very interesting.
No, that's absolutely fine. I already have in my mind precisely the sort of condition that you are talking about. Mr. Henderson.
Thank you, sir. Right, Councillor Waters' point first, please. Absolutely nothing that Councillor Waters has said with respect goes to the issue of need and the assessment of need. If, as he says, they are not definitional travellers, then there's no need that's been omitted. If they are, they have a site which meets their needs. He's not made any allegation to the contrary. The complaint about enforcement and whether or not the council, as an exercise of its discretion, considers it expedient in the public interest to take enforcement action falls out with the issues that you're considering today and have asked us to address you on. So that's Councillor Waters. The points now about the Travellers' Trust. The first point to deal with is the 30%. And the use of the 30% as a figure. Now, for your note, page 20 of the GTAA, you will see paragraphs 3.30 and 3.31, where that 30% is derived from. There's a suggestion made, and in short, it confirms what Mr. Moore has said earlier, that it confirms ORS's long experience of undertaking these surveys and the percentage that they achieve from those surveys. A suggestion made today that actually 14 out of 37 gives you a figure of 37%. Mr. Moore, can you comment on that? How robust is that an approach in terms of deciding on what percentage of undetermined needs you should take into account?
I think in his comment there, Mr. Hargreaves is actually commenting on the overall need for those who meet the planning definition and don't meet them. Figure 7 of the GTAA actually has the split between those who meet the definition and those who don't. And it's 21 do and 48 don't.
And on that basis, does that suggest that 30% is conservative or not conservative enough?
30% is relatively close to that number. It's, sorry, I will very quickly. It's 30.4%.
Thank you. And so the point here is not about, or the point that really matters here is about how that 30% is applied. Now, what that 30% is applied to is to the undetermined need.
Yes.
And in York, you will have seen from the GTAA that what we're actually applying that figure to is a very small number. Mr. Moore has explained that to you earlier. It's in the range of 0 to 2, which we're applying that 30% to get the one additional pitch. If you were to apply the 37% that was suggested, it's simply immaterial. So this is a point that's quite interesting to debate academically, but in the context of York, doesn't lead you in this assessment to any different outcome. And insofar as you need to see that in the GTAA, page 34 for your note, and you have there especially paragraph 6.31 at the bottom, you see how that's been applied. Sorry, it's 2 pictures. The need for 2 pictures for undetermined households, not 1. But the point applies. 37%, it's entirely immaterial when we're working with those numbers in this context. The next point we need to deal with is that relating to bricks and mortar accommodation. Mr. Moore, can I ask you to come in on what you've heard on that, please?
Again, as I set out at the outset, I've been working on these studies for over 15 years. I've obviously been told repeatedly that there are many households in bricks and mortar who wish to move back to sites. But that ultimately is going to require evidence, and it's going to require evidence of numbers, but it's also going to require evidence of planning status to be able to make a reasonable judgment. If those households are not approaching the council, not on the waiting list, not coming forward through other mechanisms, we do not consider it's appropriate to count an arbitrary number. we need some evidence of those numbers. I think that is the key factor.
And so you'll have heard in Mr. Hargreaves' own submissions on that point, he said it doesn't mean they're entitled. The words he used, quite so. Exactly the point that Mr. Moore is making here. So I'm afraid this is another generalised point. We have looked at the evidence that is available, we've referred you to that already, as to bricks and mortar and the use of the waiting list. And Mr. Moore has addressed you on how that's been taken into account here. The next point is Nairburn. Nothing that you've heard is...
Apologies, Mr.
Sorry.
The next point is what?
Nairburn, sir, the caravan site.
Say it again.
Nairburn. Nairburn, closer.
Yeah, remind me, how do you spell that?
That's a good question, sir. Well, I've probably spelled it incorrectly, given what I've just said. And I've got it down as Naburn.
Yeah, that's correct.
There we go. Okay, I think we're agreed on that. So what were you told? Were you told use in the pandemic, use for winter, for sites, travelling, transient, and that they moved on? Precisely so. That's exactly what the evidence was from the council this morning. This is a site which clearly has been used, may even still be used on a transient basis. But nothing of what you've been told gives any indication that there is unmet need, unmet permanent need that needs to be dealt with in the GTAA. So an interesting point, but not one that has any material impact on the assessment of need for the purpose of the GTAA with which you're concerned today. The next point is one of, which I'm going to put under the heading suppressed or hidden need. Mr. Murchis, you come in on what you've heard on that, please.
Again, I would reiterate the point I've made on bricks and mortar, that this requires evidence. We can't include numbers unless we have evidence of their need. Councils can't be expected to make provision on arbitrary assumptions around households who may exist. They need evidence of those, that their existence or their likely existence before any need could be counted.
And so this is really important because Mr. Hargreaves fully accepted that, in his words, it was difficult to quantify. So if the council was to make provision on that basis, the criticism would simply be levelled against us the other way around. That we didn't have evidence, and therefore the assessment we were making was not robust, because we would simply be speculating as to what that hidden or suppressed need would be. That's not an appropriate approach and not one that we've adopted here.
Just in relation to that, Mr. Moore, you take, in relation to undetermined need and the 30% approach based on your experience over quite a long time around the country, would it, in your view, be appropriate to make a similar assumption in relation to hidden need?
No, I'm afraid. We have looked into this. We would love to be able to say that there are X number of households in York, and we think that Y percentage of them wish to move to bricks and mortar. You know, we've looked at those kind of very simplistic ratios, but then when we've looked at our own data, many authorities, no one comes back looking for bricks and mortar. In other authorities, there are significant numbers. It varies greatly. It isn't linked to the number of households on sites already. It's not linked to anything that we could find. So it's very much a case-by-case evidence basis is the only way we'd be able to take this forward.
So the next point is PPTS, paragraph 9. What is the council required to do? It's to make an assessment of need, and I quote, in their area. And that's really important in respect of 2 points that you were addressed on. Firstly, the suggestion that you should somehow plan for in-migration. No, that approach is inconsistent with what PPTS paragraph 9 tells us to do. The second point you were addressed on linked to that was, well, sometimes you may have units where there are some members of the family that meet the definition, other parts of the extended family that do not. What are we asked to look at? PPTS paragraph 9, we're asked to look at definitional need. That's what we've done. So I'm afraid whilst there might be other objectives that York Traveller Trust would put forward to support their approach on those two issues, fundamentally it's not an approach which is compatible with paragraph 9 of PPTS. We'll come on in the supply part of this discussion to talk about non-definitional need in any event, which has been looked at by the Council.
Yeah, and I'll ask Mr. Hargreaves to comment on this question as well, because it's about what they think. I wonder, Mr. Henderson, do you, in your view, are some of the complaints from the Trust more complaints about national policy than they are necessarily about this GTAA specifically?
Well, so certainly on the points I've just addressed you, the answer to that is yes. And that in my submission applies more broadly to the more generalised complaints going to bricks and mortar and hidden need. We have an approach, PPTS Power 9, requirements of soundness. We need evidence-based decision-making, focusing on those matters. There may be other social objectives, to use a neutral term, that would encourage you to take a different approach. That's not the approach which national policy requires the Council to adopt, nor which is the consideration of your examination. So, and we'll come on to this in terms of supply, because it also comes to, well, what sort of provision and how should the Council be addressing it. The final couple of points, sir, on this. Well, we were told a very small point, but I need to make the Council's position clear. The suggestion that Council workers didn't want to cooperate or didn't want to assist with the surveys. We don't accept that. The ORS had access to the relevant team within the Council. The Council are proactively making provision where required. There is no evidence that those on the site with whom ORS spoke did anything other than cooperate, and indeed Mr. Moore has already confirmed that the relevant information was all obtained. So where does that leave us, sir? Well, Mr. Hargreaves wrapped up by saying what he wanted was a GTA that looked at the bricks and mortar issue and how you played in hidden need, which he then accepted as difficult to identify. And I'm afraid we come back to the point where I finished the first part of this session on. These are generalised complaints which don't give you an alternative figure or even any indication of what an alternative figure might be, and which are, I'm afraid, unsupported by evidence to lead you to a different conclusion to that which is set out in the GTAA. The best evidence that you have is that which is in the GTAA, and that's why we say that's a robust approach on which we can go on to consider the issue of supply.
Mr. Hargreaves, just confined to the question that I put to Mr. Henderson about whether at least some of your complaints were rather more about national policy rather than specifically about this GTAA. I asked the question, and I don't want, in asking it, to have unfairly characterised where you are coming from on this at all. So just restricted to that specific question.
Right. No, we are not. We may have differences with national policy, but we are required to, produce a robust evidence base. If I've conceded, and it would be silly of me not to concede, that there are significant methodological issues in quantifying bricks and... I mean, if I had come here with put a finger in the air and quoted a specific figure about the bricks and mortar need and about the nomadic, suppressed need, I would rightly be strongly criticised by the city council. It is equally unacceptable, in my view, for the city council to say it's difficult, therefore we'll assume it's zero. I am quite clear that there is very likely need from occupants of bricks and mortar and from a nomadic population who may or may not be resident in York, may be coming into the city, may be moving back, and who wish to move into York because they've been pushed out and have strong links with it. You would never suggest in regard to housing assessment that it's illegitimate to consider needs to migrate net move into an area. We need an evidence-based approach, but just kind of assuming likely sources of need is zero because they're too difficult is inadequate and doesn't serve York and doesn't serve the Gypsy and Traveller community well.
Okay, thank you for that. Unless the council wants to respond to what Mr. Hargreaves has said there, I'm going to move along. I think that covers all the points that people wanted to make about the GTAA itself before I move on to the question of supply, the proposed supply and the plan. Good. I don't know, Mr. Henderson?
So no, you've heard what we say. I don't accept the characterisation. It's just because it's difficult. It's because there's an absence of evidence. So to be very clear, that's why the approach has been taken. But I think supply is the next step here.
Very final bite of this particular cherry, Ms. Cunnan.
Thank you. I'm really sorry. I've kept it in for as long as I can. I just need clarity. Did York City Council pay you to look at the information they had and just feed it back to them? Surely by being researchers, it was your job to go and find the evidence. Is that not what you're paid for?
The short answer is that's not what the City Council told ORS to do. ORS did undertake their own survey. They looked for the evidence available to them, and they've reached the judgment that's in the GTAA.
And the fact that we put into our evidence a survey that we did, that doesn't count in any way as evidence.
I didn't know we were reopening this, but our position is GTA has considered all of the up-to-date evidence.
Yeah, I mean, as with many things in these examination hearings, I don't expect the people on either side of the table to agree. Otherwise, it would make my job far too easy. Okay, then let's move on to the question of supply. And as with need, what I'm going to do is ask the council, first of all, to give us all a bit of an explanation, having established what it says the need is from the GTAA, what the council has then done to accommodate that need. And I'm aware that obviously that there are some proposed main modifications to policy H5 as a result of the need identified and in relation to factors related to supply as well.
Yeah, that's correct. So we start with policy H5. The first part of the policy, which is unchanged, safeguards the existing supply. You see that at the bottom of page 106 in the submission plan. Then when we move on to the second part, which is dealing with meeting future need, the council approaches this in 3 stages. Subparagraph A deals with the provision within existing local authority sites where there is capacity or potential for extension. The modification there is to change 3 to 10, reflecting the updated need. The second part of this policy, subparagraph B, is dealing with strategic allocations. Two changes there. Firstly, to change 44 to 30, dealing with the assessment, the updated assessment, and secondly, to include the words do and. So it would be that do and do not meet the planning definition. And then within the text that goes to that part, we have strengthened the next paragraph. So applications for larger development sites of 5 hectares or more will be required to provide a number of pitches within the site or provide alternative land that meets the criteria set out in Part C of the policy to accommodate the required number of pitches. Commuted sum payments to contribute to development of pitches elsewhere will only be considered where on or off-site delivery is proven unviable, and then you have the original text looking at what those calculations are. And then Part C deals with the criteria-based approach, and that is unchanged from the submission version. Turning over to policy H6, travel and show people, and I think it's fair to say that this policy is not the one. This is the subject to the most controversy, but I will deal with it briefly in any event. Safeguarding existing supply, that's the first part, as with policy H5. Minor amendment of proposals to policies map. Meeting future need, an amendment of 3 to 4 show people plots. A deletion of the final sentence there, though, as to when that need arises because of the new information. The allocation of SP1, the stables Elvington for 3 plots. And then Part B deals with employment sites, and Part C deals with planning applications, again a criteria-based approach. So that is the policy as it's before you with our proposed modifications to it. If I can just touch on the strategy, especially in H5, that has been adopted here. The starting point for the council, and Mr Jones will give you some of the detail on this, is to look at extensions or increases in capacity of the council's own sites. In our view, that is the best place to start. It reflects the characteristics of the Gypsy and Traveller community in York, both historically and presently, and I've addressed you on that. And it's controllable and deliverable. The council has a track record of bringing forward sites from within its own portfolio in York, and it can leverage that here, in particular in circumstances where there is an absence of other willing landowners with appropriate sites. And to do that, the council is in the process of recruiting a Gypsy and Traveller officer. The council's already secured significant Section 106 contributions to that end and to the delivery of further pitches on its own site. So that work is already well underway. I pause there because Mr Jones can give you some, perhaps a summary of the potential capacity increases and extensions that are available to the council.
Thank you. So yeah, as described, we are looking to create a new post, which will be a Gypsy and Traveller accommodation officer. Their role will solely be about the delivery of additional pitches within the city. I think we acknowledge fully that this will rely on strong working relationships with existing residents of those sites and the Travellers Trust. We're attempting to start that positive dialogue where we've shared the draft job description with the Travellers Trust to make sure that we're picking up on the key issues and the key challenges within that job description, and we've had feedback from the Trust in the last few days, which is positive. We aim to have that post recruited to this year. The post will focus on 3 key elements. So as described, looking at opportunities within the existing sites, So taking one example, the site in Clifton has over 2,500 square metres of undeveloped land on it within the, at the moment, and we think there's opportunities to deliver additional pitches alongside improvements on that site. The council has a significant land estate. There'll be opportunities to utilise in this post to consider other land that's available, if required, to deliver additional pitches. And then the third part of the role will be to support developers in the delivery of additional pitches on strategic sites or other land that those developers put forward as an alternative, as per the policy. The role will sit within our highly successful housing delivery team, which consists of about 12 members of staff at the moment, delivering housing across multiple sites in the city. That's both council-owned sites and sites that have been purchased on the open market. There's a strong skill set in that team around project management and a lot of support that can wrap around this new post to support the delivery of additional pitches in the city. Also within that team is a self-build officer, as I've described previously at the hearing, which is about facilitating others to bring forward sites and land that meets their housing needs. So we've heard today from the Travellers Trust about the difficulty of Travellers Trust identifying suitable land and identifying suitable land and bringing it forward. Then this could be capacity within the council to support Gypsy and Travellers in terms of trying to identify suitable land and to take them through that planning process.
So that takes us on to part B of the policy, the delivery within strategic allocations. And the council... Sorry.
Yeah, apologies, Mr Henderson. Yeah, just so I'm clear, looking at policy H5 and the opening paragraph in part A, as proposed to be modified, it says, in order to meet the need of gypsies and travellers that meet the planning definition, 10 additional pitches will be, well, it says identified. Should that be provided? Is that what the plan is seeking to do?
So yes, I don't think we would object to the word provided instead of identified. That would be absolutely fine from our perspective. If I might turn to part B, sir, unless you want to dwell on that further.
I do want to dwell there just a little longer. So there are, then I hear 3 local authority sites in the area. I don't know if I need a breakdown of those or not, or to know their names, but either way, is there sufficient capacity within those sites collectively to provide those 10 additional pitches?
Yes, sir, we've identified up to 10 pitches from initial work on that. So that's where the figure is derived from. What we haven't done, though, is go into any more detail on this because, as you've described, it's coming forward. And it may be that some sites grow by less than 10 and cumulatively it's 10, or it might be on the Clifton site that it's provision of up to 10. So there's an inherent need to be flexible there, not least because the council could also look to use other parts of its estate. But that is the indicative work to date. And you see those 3 sites actually listed on the, at the start of the policy, those which are safeguarded, the 3 bullet points.
So we have an overall figure of 10, which will be distributed in one way or another across those 3 sites.
Correct. That's how the policy works, sir. And to be very clear, the other benefit of that is it delivers the 5-year supply, which is 9. And because they are council sites, already owned, already in use, with the support that Mr Jones has described, they are deliverable for that purpose.
Okay, I have clarity on that now, and I think you're about to take me to part B of policy H5.
So yes, so the approach of part B is to require provision within the strategic allocations in the same way that we require the provision of on-site affordable housing. It's an approach which is consistent with the NPPF. See, in particular, paragraph 159, second bullet point of the NPPF 2012. And insofar as you want the corresponding paragraph, it's paragraph 62 of NPPF 2021. It's an approach which has been used elsewhere. Aylesbury, Guildford, more recently Epping, are all examples of a similar approach. And our submission, again, it is an appropriate and effective solution in the context of York, bearing in mind the constraints on land availability that you've heard and the constraints on willing landowners. This is a mechanism on these large strategic sites which allows provision to be brought forward with much greater certainty. And you've heard from Ms. Bartle previously on the deliverability of those sites. So these are deliverable sites, or worst case developable sites that we've identified where this can be required of it. There is flexibility. It allows for the provision of a commuted sum where that's unviable, where the delivery is unviable, and those sums feed into the work that Mr. Jones has described. And the council's already obtained 3 very significant Section 106 payments on that basis already. I give you the details of those. York Central, £900,000. Monk's Cross, £450,000, albeit that's currently at appeal, but in the agreed 106 that will be £450,000. And Boroughbridge Road, £300,000. And so I pause there to address a point that's made against us by the York Travellers Trust. They say, well, in the appeal by Miller Homes relating to ST2, the inspector had concerns about whether that requirement was still Reg 122 compliant. The short answer, it is still Reg 122 compliant. It certainly will be once we've adopted this policy, and in light of the further evidence that you've heard from Mr. Jones as to how those contributions are going to be used. The inspector was concerned that she didn't have evidence of how it's going to be used. Well, that was in 2019. The picture's moved on quite significantly. That evidence is available. And indeed, the fact that the council secured contributions elsewhere shows that this is something that developers are now alive to, and where it's not provided on site. And the short point is, if you deleted the word Gypsy and Traveller and put in affordable housing, nobody would say anything about Seal Reg 122. So that's a concern that doesn't go anywhere in our submission. And then finally, sir, part C.
Forgive me, just from my note, you gave me the 3 figures for the 3 sites, York Central, Monk's Cross and Boroughbridge Road.
Yeah.
Did you say that those are in current signed 106s?
I think all 3 are. Let me double check. So okay, the first 2 are, sir, York Central and Monk's Cross. Certainly the first 2, so there's some doubt over the third, but certainly the first 2, York Central and the Monk's Cross. Ms. Bartle will check the third of those, but certainly the first 2. So that takes us on to part 3 of the policy. This is the criteria-based approach. So it's a positive policy. Proposals will be permitted where, and then you get the criteria 1 through to 5. There doesn't appear to be any controversy over those criteria and the representations that we've seen, and they are in our submission appropriate. The only thing I need to add here we will come on to GB4, policy GB4. There was a proposal to modify that to make reference to Gypsy and traveller sites. That's a modification the council won't be asking you to make when we get to phase 4. But I only raise that now because the Travellers Trust referred to it in their matter statement, so I wish to make our position entirely clear on that. We can deal with that in phase 4, but for the purposes of the discussion we'll have, it's useful if all parties are clear. So that is the approach that we've adopted in this policy, bearing in mind what you've already heard about the characteristics of the community, the difficulties in finding available land, but the need within those constraints to adopt a workable solution. This, in our submission, is such a solution. So the Bowerbridge Road contribution, I can explain that to you. It was signed in the 106, but it was a 106 which had one of those usual blue pencil clauses. If the inspector says it's not 122 compliant, then it drops away. So that's where we were with that. So it's the first two that have been obtained, but